Diolch, Kath. Good morning. My name's Carrie Smith. I'm the Deputy Head and a Year 6 teacher in Hendredenny Primary.
And I'm Samantha Jenkins, and I'm the Year 5 teacher.
So this a little pen portrait of our schools. So we've got a single form entry. We have got a relatively low number of free school meals and a relatively low number of ALN pupils. Sorry, it's a busy day today. And we've got our catchment is generally white British, so not terribly diverse. However, demographics have been changing over the last few years. And we are really keen to develop literacy. So we've got a very strong, sorry, Kath, can you move on for me, please? Thank you. So in foundation learning, we've got a tradition in this school of very strong decoding skills built up from the very earliest years using systematic phonics. It's tracked very closely, and most children make really good progress with that system. We know how important the literacy skills are for pupils' wider curriculum skills. So we always look to ways to improve those. Staff are always looking to improve reading and looking to improve ways of teaching comprehension. We also have already started implementing Teach Like a Champion strategies. We've been doing that for a number of years now. So when we had the opportunity to take on some Reading Reconsidered training, we leapt at the chance. Thanks, Kath. So one of the things I think struck us both when we started the training was, it was from the Reading Reconsidered, but the wider reading that we've begun to do as well, was the Matthew effect. So this is not new research, but I think it summed up and it crystallised really what we knew. But sometimes I think, gut feelings and we may say, oh, that sounds like common sense, but it's good to have that research background that with reading, then the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. So there's a little diagram there that will show. So it means that, obviously the better the children's comprehension, the better their reading, the more likely they are for that success to continue and build. Whereas other children, if they start off with those poor reading skills, they're less likely to catch up and make the same sort of progress. So we're really anxious to avoid that where we can. So we also... So what another element that really struck us through our reading and through the Reading Reconsidered training was that successful comprehension is not just about applied skills, because I think we've all done it. We've all taught finding the main idea, or we've taught sessions on inference. But what really struck us was some of the research from Wexler, which was that vocabulary and knowledge is really powerful, and that link between vocabulary knowledge and better comprehension. And obviously, it's something that runs through the curriculum for Wales as well as a cross-curricular skill that, we need literacy to unlock the knowledge of the rest of the curriculum. Thanks, Kath. So we had two different cohorts that we were focused on, and we had undertaken a little bit of sort of pre-research, really. We often give out little questionnaires for the children for a variety of different things. And one of them was about library use. We were keen to kind of analyse how much the children were reading for pleasure, how much they were using the school library. And the results showed that it had actually quite, reduced for some. The children were quite honest and saying, well, actually, the reading that they had been doing was being started to be replaced by online gaming and social media at home, obviously. And this echoes research that has been produced by the National Literacy Trust that finds that there's a dip in reading enjoyment between the ages of 8 and 11. So before that and after that, reading for pleasure is actually, generally quite good, but there is this dip. We also found as well that while we had confident readers and good decoders, there could be some reluctance to read aloud during group and whole class sessions. So even when children were quite able and confident, they were a little bit self-conscious and self-aware. So we were looking to kind of try and reduce and eliminate that as well. And what we found as well is that, we would teach AOLEs, we would teach our topics, but when it came to assessing or the children being able to apply the vocabulary and the concepts they'd learned, we found that sometimes there were gaps. So we were looking at ways that we could develop that. So our ultimate aim although we approach things in slightly different ways, was that we were going to look for ways to develop vocabulary and explore its impact on the pupils' reading and their knowledge. Diolch. So in year 6, my class, I took it as a whole class approach, and I developed an 8-week interruption of practice. We did some work a little while ago with the University of Stirling, and they do something called the CCPE approach. And so I kind of mimicked that. So I planned an interruption of practice. So it was a change. It was a move away from what we'd previously done. So it was easier to measure impact. So there was a bit of preparation to begin with. We'd chosen a class book. I still grouped the children by ability for the guided group reading sessions, but it was our book slam book, so we'd entered the book slam competition, and so what that meant is I had control over exactly the vocabulary that they were all being introduced to. So from that, I would pick some challenging vocabulary from each chapter, and I would use Microsoft Forms online and create an online form or a quiz, as I called it, with the children. And if you look to the left of the screen, you'll see an example of that. So the word misdemeanors was there. It was one that quite few children had actually encountered, and I'd give them a couple of different options. What that meant is that because it was electronic, I could get a breakdown quite easily of the results. The children would have a go at completing the form before they'd read the text, and like I said, it's a multiple choice format. Then what would happen is I would introduce the techniques. So we'd go through them, particularly the phase reading we looked at. So, I was encouraging them to read with fluency, that accountability, to be social. We talk a lot about pro-social listening and things in class as part of Teach Like a Champion anyway. So to move that, to shift that into the guided group reading sessions was not a huge culture shift. Children would then take part in the guided group reading sessions, and then we would repeat the vocabulary quiz immediately after to see the immediate impact. But obviously, we do need to keep that vocabulary on the boil, because of, again, something that had come through from the Teach Like a Champion and Reading Reconsidered reading, that there's something called the forgetting curve. I'm sure some of you have already seen, all of you have seen this. Thanks, Kath. So on this slide here is an example of the forgetting curve, and how it just shows and demonstrates how important repetition and revisiting vocabulary and knowledge is. Diolch.
Okay, in year 5, I carried this out more as a group. So I used a group of children who are classed as middle ability readers, and we looked at the text, and through phase reading, which is something that we were not doing before, we started using phase reading to just try to encourage engagement. And we saw that this significantly encouraged them to read aloud, track the text, and they were then able to find words that they were not familiar with. But initially, when we did this, we were stopping so much so that to define the words and talk about the words, that it stopped the flow of the text. So I had a little think about it and what we could do, and we decided that whenever we would come across a word, the children in the middle of the table where we carried out the guided reading session, it would be a piece of paper, and if there was a word, we would just jot it down if there was a word that we felt unfamiliar with. And then after, as their reading response, they would go and they would collaborate together, and they would find the meaning of the words. So we worked on how we would go and find them, where was the best places to find them. Some of the definitions that we found still didn't make it clear what it was. So it really helped us to develop our DCF skills by looking using keywords to find the sources. And then they would come together and they would collaborate and make their own child created knowledge organizer. There's an example of it I can show you a little bit further on, but it allowed them to discuss words. And I think as they started, one of the words was milestone, and lots of them, once they had discussed it and they started talking about it, they realized that they had encountered this word before, but because they hadn't put meaning to it and hadn't made it meaningful to themselves, it was a word that was there, but they didn't really totally understand it. So it was really lovely to hear them having these conversations and really making meaning from the words. And we recently went to Aberfan, and we went up to the cemetery, and there was a milestone, and they said, oh look, there's the word, that's the word we were talking about, there's a milestone. So it was really lovely that they're still using these words. And like Carrie said, it's that repetition. We put these new words then onto the board, and we try to put them into every context that we can, so that they can see these words coming to life in more than one context, which allows them to make those connections. And we also did questionnaires then. So with the questionnaires, we did multiple choice, we did it before and after, and we saw that the impact was really successful. They were really starting to take on the words. They didn't know all of them, but you could see that the retention was much greater, and successful, and they enjoyed learning vocabulary this way, which was really, really good.
Diolch. So we evaluated both of the strands, both of the little projects interruptions that we had undertaken. As I said already, the fact that we'd had some digital forms from both classes, but at first the digital forms weren't going to play a part of the year fives project, but actually we found that it might have, it was a useful tool for us to be able to gather and make a comparison. As both groups, as a common theme, we saw, and as an anecdotal just observation, we found that there was improved independence in pupils' reading and their vocabulary activities, and far more confidence when reading aloud. So there was a real development of a risk-free culture, and taking a risk, having a go at a word, and understanding that no one's going to judge you if you mispronounce it, because that's what we all do. The immediate impact for year 6 was that their understanding had improved. So using the data from the quizzes, pre-read and pre-phase reading, their understanding of vocabulary, all of the vocabulary definitions, was around 44%. So immediately after, the scores doubled. So it wasn't totally it wasn't total understanding, but it was a huge increase. So they were able to choose the correct definition, but obviously we were aware of that forgetting curve. So I repeated it later, and they'd retained 60%. We didn't review the vocabulary in a formal way as the year 5 children did. So as a comparison, that's something we definitely need to take on board, is that that reviewed emphasis on it and applying it to different contexts. But it's just good to know that just through that explicit teaching, their retention was good and had increased. But we know it's really important to keep it on the boil and avoid that forgetting curve. What was really nice to see as well is that the results compared really favourably to topic-based vocabulary. So we came across the word voluminous. I don't think very, very few children could define that before we introduced it. And it compared really favourably to the word reservoir, which we encountered probably hundreds of times during an AOLE while we was doing some humanities work. Diolch, Kath. So a follow-up for year 6, they began to run their own reciprocal reading sessions. Generally, this was with the more able pupils, but what was lovely is that they were, independently, not just using the dictionaries, but going off to seek what the vocabulary was. They were much more aware that they didn't always understand the vocabulary, and they were keen to seek out the definitions, which was a lovely change to see. This gradual release is recommended in Reading Reconsidered as accountable independent reading, but I think the important thing is that the accountability was there, and I think that was something that shone through the year 5's work, is that they were accountable to each other because they were sharing their knowledge organisers, and so they knew that they had to have things that were the words well defined, because other children were going to be using them, and actually they would challenge each other on them as well. They
really enjoyed putting together knowledge organisers, and the vocabulary, the the collaboration was incredibly rich for them. They have since said to me, when they're doing a piece of writing in another context, can I go and get my knowledge organizer, which are in their books, and they'll bring them out. And we're starting to see words now creeping into their writing in other areas of the curriculum, which is fantastic. But this is what we want them to do. We want them to build a vocabulary and then be confident in using it. Yes, they're still seeking out those knowledge organizers and they go to find them, but that's fantastic. That's the first step. And there are examples now on the next slide of them using some of these words. They have now put them into their writing, and it's not words that they would have used before. So it's really lovely that they feel confident enough to have a go. And that's all come from finding the definitions themselves. So identifying the words that they're unfamiliar with initially, then finding the definitions with their peers, which is fantastic, because now that they're trained and able to, and they do that, we have regular basic skills sessions in our school where children work independently to develop their target. And these children now can do this independently. Initially, I would work with them and help them, but now they do it, and they are bringing together really good definitions, which we have a bank of. So the children will work on them, refer to them, share them, and it's them. They have meaning. They put images in with them. There's text. They change the definitions. We talked about not just copying a definition, because I think traditionally that's what we would do. We would just pick the first definition we could find and we would pop that in. We've come away from that. The children really have to discuss it, break it down, and put it into their own words, which is fantastic. And as a result, it's starting to feed into their writing, which is exactly what we wanted it to do, because their vocabulary is increasing.
So going back to the online questionnaires, Year 5's vocabulary retention was 80%. So after they had worked on the knowledge organisers, the questionnaire was done again a little bit after the project, and so this was actually higher than the their retention was better than the Year 6s, and we feel that this is probably through the repeated exposure to this vocabulary and the fact that they had put the words into their own context and made it meaningful for them. There's a lot, the impact on reading for pleasure was immense. Again, it's anecdotal, but through observations and through comments that we noted down during guided group reading sessions, there was much more of a buzz, and that response where you get, okay, it's time for you to do some guided group reading phase. You could see the enjoyment and the pleasure. I think something that I found particularly this year is that there are children who are reluctant to step away from books that have got sequels and things. So there might be a particular range of books, and they're not very interested in reading anything from outside of those. And there's nothing wrong with having some favorite books, but it was quite hard to get them interested, or to choose something else. But what was lovely is this comment summed it up. I used to read the same books over and over, but reading like this makes me want to read other books now, which was lovely. And that was a child who was particularly one who was hung up on a series and did not want to let go of the series. Weekly reading questionnaires show that there's an increase in enjoyment. So I often give them a little weekly questionnaire, ask them how much reading for pleasure they've done at home, what they are reading. I ask them to set targets. And in the autumn term, I found about 39% of the children were reading for 20 minutes a day. By this term, it's increased to 61%. Obviously, we have to be very careful with self-reported data, but I think it's still valid that we make sure we place in value on pupil voice. And, there's no, it's very risk-free. So there's no gains for them increasing it. I just let them be as honest as they want. In terms of our own pedagogy and our own skills, I think that we've both noticed a massive improvement in our own ability to teach reading and an awareness of what we're teaching and how we're teaching it, particularly with vocabulary, and not just in literacy sessions and reading sessions, but across the curriculum. We are linking the words to other situations and concepts throughout the day. We've both noticed a particular increase in define and pronounce as well. So I think that we've often maybe pointed out a word and defined it for children, but I think that pronunciation, making sure that they are getting getting their own mouths around it is really important. We've both felt that we're much more skilled in keeping a narrative thread going, being aware of that, the load on working memory, so that if we're going through a narrative and we're giving very wordy definitions, it breaks up the flow of the narrative, and then it makes it harder for children to retain that working, it makes it harder for them to retain the thread, and it puts more pressure on their working memory. So we're using much shorter interjections. And there's a lot more flexibility around when the techniques are used. So even though we might not have planned to use it, for example, I didn't necessarily plan to define and pronounce all the Welsh and Polish names of vocabulary in the text that we had, we kept it on the boil. We kept doing it because the children needed it. They couldn't necessarily pronounce all the names and they needed that repetition. And again, while anecdotal, there's been real evidence of transferable skills. So one of the words was lured that we'd had in the text, and children were applying it to other concepts and actually making jokes as well. So it shows that they're retaining it and then they're using it in other contexts. So again, observational and anecdotal, but it's something that we're certainly going to look into.
Here is an example of one of the knowledge organisers that Year 5 made. They collaborate, so it's really fantastic for them to work together, but just standing around them, and I think that's the next step, is actually to film one of these sessions, just to hear the rich discussions that the children have with each other. They read each other's definitions, they talk about it, and then they've got into a habit of, oh, I know that I've come across this word here. So they're sharing their experiences with each other. And I think that it's so valuable for children to have time to talk about vocabulary instead of us just saying, this is a new word, this is what it means. It's having that really important time to get to grips with it, to say it, to make sense of it. And I think that's what these knowledge organisers have done. We've also used knowledge organisers where, for example, when we were teaching about the Aberfan disaster, we've used teacher-led knowledge organisers to introduce new words. And I don't think the retention was as great as these. I do really think the children taking ownership of developing their own vocabulary has had a huge impact on Year 5. And these are not my higher ability readers, these are middle ability readers, but it's really, really helped them, and they love doing it. They work together. It doesn't take long. And like I said, it's become quite an independent task now, so that they know how to go and find the definitions and how to make sense of those definitions, which sometimes is still quite difficult because the definitions themselves have tricky vocabulary in them. So it's been really valuable, and they've really enjoyed it. So something we'll definitely continue and develop.
Sorry, Kath, do you mind just going back a second? I'll be as quick as I can. Thanks. So what we're going to do now in terms of our own school is we're going to embed phased reading across the whole school, and particularly in literacy sessions and guided group reading, but obviously across the curriculum as well. We're going to embed the accountable independent reading and that gradual release as well to improve independence with the older learners. We're going to strengthen modelled reading as well. So on the next slide, I'll go into that in a bit more depth, but I think that struck us as well as we've gone through and we've been doing some reading around the subject, how the importance of modelled reading for pupils, and particularly when we have challenging and complex texts. Again, I think sometimes we've maybe assumed that because we've got good decoders that their comprehension is similarly good, but I think we probably need to pay more attention and strengthen our modelled reading. And we are going to continue to create some knowledge organisers, both adult created, as we've already been using for our AOLEs, but also we're going to do far more, I think, pupil created knowledge organisers to strengthen that retention and encourage application independently. Diolch. So what we've already started sharing the technique. So we've given the staff a little bit of a taste of it, haven't we? And a bit of flavour of it in an inset today, but we're going to do that in a bit more depth. We've also started working with the teaching assistants. So Sam has done some sessions, coaching them and working through some of the sessions, but we need to start monitoring and evaluating the impact. We need to share the findings of this case study as well. And from this, we've started to develop some targets for next year's SDP as well. So, you know, the Curriculum for Wales guidance talks about the children being able to apply and use previously acquired knowledge and skills, you know, applying these to other contexts. So the year 6 pupils and the year 5 and the year 6 pupils are demonstrating application, but this hasn't been formally observed or recorded. So this is going to form a line of inquiry for next year. And we're also going to delve a bit deeper into some of the other reading reconsidered techniques and start thinking about the reading plagues as well, in terms of the text that we're offering the pupils. In terms of research, I think again something that struck us is that pupils retain more complex concepts and vocabulary through listening rather than their own reading until 13. So I think that really struck us as we were working through this, and thought, well, you know, we need to be giving more opportunities to be reading aloud and modelling aloud those complex texts across the curriculum, and we need to raise this with the rest of the staff as well. And we're going to develop some further AOLE planning and resources linked to text, so you're really exploiting the knowledge and vocabulary that we've got in existing resources, and developing those knowledge organisers and perhaps some word walls as well, just to make sure that vocabulary is as available as possible. Diolch.